Pereira. Jonathan is the executive director at the Plant Chicago, the nonprofit house out of the plant, where he's working to cultivate local circular economies. He believes the circular economy is a collaborative practice, which means collaborating across many sectors. He sees a future where businesses work together to ensure that both of the economy and environment are thriving. Since joining Plant Chicago in 2015, he guided the organization to shift focus on local systems, both inside and outside of the facility known as the plant. Plant Chicago now hosts over 4,000 local youth each year on educational programs, works with over 45 businesses to implement, manages a shared use mycology lab, and open sources over 20 different research projects online. Please welcome Jonathan to the stage.
Bear with me while there's a little bit of rustling. I got a line that I can't cross over here, right?
You just can't cross in front of the light.
It's kind of like a nightmare. I have doing a PowerPoint presentation on a Monday night after a couple hours of an open bar. There's a first for everything. Am I a little too loud?
Are you good?
Good. All right. I'm Jonathan. I'm the Executive Director of Plant Chicago. Thank you for having me here. Just trying to get a sense of the audience here. How many of you have heard of the term circular economy before? How many of you that raised your hands would feel really comfortable like defining it? Oh, sure, all right, okay. That's okay because there isn't any standard definition of it. This is good? If I float over here, if I get up on the stage?
You can do whatever you want.
I don't want to block the screen as well. I'm very aware of sightlines here. I'll also say to any point during this, when I'm talking, if you have a question, comment, or anything, just raise your hand. Would love to have this be more of a discussion than just me talking the whole time. So our mission is to cultivate local circular economies. We envision a paradigm shift in production, consumption, and waste driven at the local level, generating equity and economic opportunity for all residents. So when I had that, our mission there is our cultivating local circular systems. We're focused on the small and the hyper-local, small businesses, local neighborhood level impact. Circular economies, does this have a little laser pointer? Maybe not. Yeah, it does, good, cool. There we go. So circular economies, for those of you that are familiar, is very much, most of the movement behind this and sort of the thought leadership is coming from places in Europe as well. People in America have been not in Canada necessarily, but in the US, have been much more skeptical of this phrase, which is good. I think it's healthy. It's a good quality to have, to be skeptical of it and critical of it. Let's start with this. Some of you might have anyone seen this Sankey diagram before for the inputs and outputs? This is something the World Resources Institute put together a few years ago, literally looking at all of our carbon emissions. And the nice thing about Sankey diagrams, you know, Sankey diagrams are these things that people are familiar with. I feel like this is an audience that might actually know about these. So, is this something you all pay a lot of attention to on a normal basis? Or not at all? Great. Okay, they're great, it's okay. Basically, it's when you do like an analysis of all of the impacts of any sort of production. The World Resources did this thinking about GHG emissions globally by sector. So how many of you would consider yourselves a part of the agriculture sector? Okay, so agriculture they found to be, they're saying it's 13.5% of GHG emissions. And most of that coming from, where do you think? Livestock and manure, 5%, and then agriculture and soils. So that's actually, it's methane and nitrous oxide is coming out mostly, not necessarily carbon dioxide. And this audience, I'm sure, is aware of methane as being much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. It's often referred to as, like, you'll hear estimates anywhere from 20 to 100 times more potent. That usually has to do with the fact of how long they're thinking methane actually stays as methane in the atmosphere and doesn't break down. So when it first comes out, some people will say, well, it's 100 times more potent, but over time it doesn't last as long in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, so they'll average that out to 20 times more potent, or 18 or 24, depending on who you're talking to. So I bring this up because fossil fuels are, along with plastics, or single-use plastic, or a classic linear system, right? We extract on one end, we take it out of the earth, and it ends up somewhere where we don't recover it again. Yes, nice.
So for the agricultural,
Yeah,
is there, obviously this is world, right? So
This is global,
if you
yeah.
If you took China versus US versus, there's probably some major, I would guess the 2080 rule would really apply here. You know, China, United States, India kind of being main contributors to that. Is there kind of a validation of that?
Are you talking about per capita, or
Yeah,
as a
total to the
yeah.
13.5%. There's probably 80% is like maybe 3 countries that are contributing to that. Just
So-
based on, right, production.
Yeah, I don't know, I mean, but you could
Brazil-
extrapolate out to the largest
Brazil is
population
one of
as
the
well.
largest cattle producers,
Yeah.
right?
And some of that is, like, when we focus globally, it's helpful too because, right, we're getting, China's up until recently had been getting a lot of agricultural products from the US, right?
Imports.
We're getting a lot of imports from China all over the place. So it depends on how you break it down. If you're talking about diet, right? Not India, right? It would be the US, it would be much more developed countries that are relying much more on
That are
things like
creating
beef,
anything.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's livestock that are creating a lot of the GHGs, right? But it's not exclusive to livestock, obviously, if we're tilling the soils and burning forests to do it. Any crop that's an annual crop where we till it every year, right, we're releasing more carbon into the atmosphere. But going back to linear systems, it's really, we're not recapturing carbon. Or are we? There are things that do recapture carbon, right? Plants, trees. There's other technology that can do it as well, but the system itself that we've created is not doing it, right? We're releasing it. We're taking all that stored energy, and from millions of years ago during the Carboniferous period, all that solar energy that plants aggregated and then stored in the earth, we're taking that and just like a giant battery have released all that. We're releasing all that energy into the atmosphere. So fossil fuels are a classic linear system. You can make the argument it's circular, right? The carbon cycle is a circular system. The line that we're on as a circle is so big, like to recapture that carbon, it might as well be a line for people. If our average lifespan is 79 or 76 years. This is a nice, I like this one from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. They did a study a few years ago around global plastics, so single-use plastic. Without looking at this, I'll just go back, you already, so let's see who actually wrote the diagram first. Global plastic, single-use plastic, how much do we think is actually getting recycled? It was already up there, so if you know.
78, 10%.
Okay, somewhere between 10 and 78%. Nice. Yeah, you're both right. It's actually closer to 14 or 16%. So let's look at this. So they found that this is globally, again, of single-use plastic. So plastic that's been made to be used once. So typically any type of packaging. The crazy thing here, right, is that 40% is being landfilled. And the study that came out last year in Chicago that made us all a little bit more cynical that like the recycling rate went down from 11% to like 9 point something. It's sort of a classic, just breeding more cynicism. But thinking about the fact that closer to a third of it leaks into the environment, right? So this is the big existential crisis of many packaging companies, right? Is that, and also companies that produce lots of plastic, like beverage companies that are selling lots of single uses, is tackling that. It's a major, not only a major problem, it's a major perception problem. And I'm sure you're all aware of this as well, thinking about single-use plastic. But globally, this system is linear. we're making a durable product, plastic, it's a great material, that's made to last, and we use it once. So, and of that too, when we recycle, if you're familiar with plastic, most of the time we recycle plastic is downgraded, it's downcycled. We're creating a plastic that typically is not as good or has less value when you recycle. Only 2% is so-called closed loop recycling, where it gets made into a plastic that is of equal value to what it was before it was. So the key to a circular system, I was raised thinking a lot about recycling, and I think when many people talk about sustainability, they're like, I recycle. Well, really, when you recycle, that's like in an ideal circular system, that's the last thing you really want. You don't want to make products, you want to make products that can be recycled, but ideally make products that will be reused, or products that don't actually need to exist in the first place, like something like actually having a service instead of a product. Has anyone seen this diagram before? Okay, this was what the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, again, that's a thought leader on circular economies, they developed this diagram probably 6 or 7 years ago. And it's building on like the idea of cradle to cradle, if you're familiar with that, of 2 different types of nutrients, 2 different types of materials, biological, the things we eat and make and grow, and then technical would be things like plastics and metal, so-called, you could talk about durable or fast-moving goods. Yes?
The question on
Yeah.
packaging.
Yeah.
So I've seen more upstart startups will have like compostable like material,
Mm-hmm.
whereas when you see for bigger, larger conventional food companies, it's cost prohibitive in order for them to go down that path. Do you think, in terms of like a path to get everybody away from plastic is to make it economically more feasible for people to switch to the compostable material, or get to the price point where that actually,
Well, you could force it. I mean, the EU is banning single-use plastic, right? So if a governmental entity actually forces the issue, that's where companies have to figure it out, right? So there's that. Probably not going to happen in the U.S. anytime soon, regardless of who's at the top. I think even if you had any of the other candidates that are running for president, I don't think any of them are running on a platform to ban single-use plastic, right? But compostables itself, again, the trick there with composting is that you typically have the infrastructure in place in the U.S. to deal with that type of compostable. So what I love actually in Chicago, now you see a lot of restaurants have moved over to compostable plates and compostable cutlery. The cutlery is an issue that doesn't really break down very easily. And it often just goes to a landfill anyway. That's not an argument not to use it, but we should, if you can use like forks and knives that get used over and over again, and we've used for centuries, right? That's ideal because that's material that is getting reused. It's not, again, this is not like really like a super new concept. It's moving back to a non-disposable, moving away towards a culture that's not disposable. Compostable stuff, plates, you can compost those, and there are people and companies that take it, like compostable plates, and they can do compostable packaging. And some of the bags, there are compostable bags now that will break down in compost piles. They generally have to be much larger. Some companies don't like it. Yeah.
So it's a mindset. So regenerative, restorative versus obsolescence, where the whole economy is based on obsolescence, right?
Yes.
Cars, you name it, right?
Yeah.
So are you seeing, or can you share where you're seeing signs of this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, say food, right? Food is a big, restaurants and chefs are pushing a lot of this. Like, you see many chefs that push knowing where their food has come from, knowing the farmers, knowing regenerative practices that are coming from. That's a huge market driver, yes. Yeah.
So I would agree,
Yeah.
and I would say, part of it's coming from venture capital and private equity firms that are willing to say triple bottom line,
Yeah.
and that are willing to invest in kind of these type of economies, are you seeing kind of in Chicago where you're really kind of starting out, you're creating a new vision in a way, are you seeing some traction there with getting people to invest in this with you?
You
Is that
all
fair?
probably might know a little bit more. So we don't typically work with a lot of companies that are like looking for equity investment or things. I'm familiar with them. I'm aware, we actually had a conversation at this table around food companies operating like tech companies. So yes, there's a big impact there when you talk about processed plant-based meat or alternatives to meat. Plant-based meat is not what we're talking about anymore. What is it?
No.
It's plant proteins, plant-based meat. It's all plant-based meat. We're plant-based meat. But getting back to this diet, did I answer that question? I don't really know.
We're good.
Yeah.
You know, what I'm looking at is like the ecosystem, the mentality is, you know, we are gonna invest, you know, the mentality is, hey, let's create obsolescence, because it creates more, right? So what your kind of proposition, which is right, is restorative, and so to me that's a shift in mindset, and it has to be invested in.
Right.
And there has to be a way for them to go, there's a return on investment. It's happening, there's portfolios that are investing in this, but because you're in Chicago and it's such a food community, I was just trying to see how you see the trend.
So I'll say one thing. If you look at this sign, like sort of technical nutrients and durable goods, that's a big problem, planned obsolescence, right?
Yeah, it is.
Most models, or many different business models are designed to sell us more stuff. So like fast-moving fashion, right? Forever 21 was very, much based on this model of like sell you as like, hey, quickly, we're gonna get you the next fashion, and the next fashion, keep buying, it doesn't last very long. So like that, it's not technically this side of it, because you're talking cotton, right? It's not always cotton, but the idea of like selling you more stuff, that's just selling you something that's gonna last a long time for more money. Or not selling you the stuff to begin with at all, and just selling you a service where you can have the stuff. So some of the more outrageous companies that I don't know if anything exists like this in the US, but there's like a company in the UK where you lease jeans from them, right? So they don't actually, you lease your clothing. So you're paying, like, I have a subscription to have 2 jeans a month, and then when I don't want them anymore, I give it back to the company and they recapture that material.
Or you reuse clothing.
Yeah. So I mean, we have this idea now, like companies that are selling us our phones, right? Some of them have a vested interest to recapture that material because they see the value in like the metals and things that they put into it. Or they realize now that if you give your used thing back, they're more likely to shop from them again. So there's more companies, big companies, I think, that are realizing like, oh, it's a good idea for me to have trade-ins or to bring in materials and to recapture that because you do shop there again. Visit IKEA, right? They just have, this is what I found interesting. I was actually, when IKEA made this announcement, I think it was in Canada, did you see that they had this model to like refurbish furniture, where you can return it to them for a credit? Their furniture, not other people's furniture, but you can return it for a credit. And then you can use it to buy more stuff, right? So they're looking at this as a way to recapture the materials, but also recognizing if you bring it back to them, you're more likely to buy something else there as well. So, but I remember hearing jokes in the US, like late night talk shows making fun of IKEA for doing it, whereas like here in Canada, people are like celebrating, like, oh, that's great, they're recapturing materials. So there is a different mentality, I think, still in the US, like, oh, like a company doing that is odd and strange, and we should make fun of them. The biological side, these circles here kind of represent like more energy. This is not at all to scale or anything like that, but the closer you get to the center here, like if you're maintaining it and have a durable good, there's less energy overall that goes into it. If you're if you're sharing it, right, that's a really tight circle. If you're refurbishing, you get further out. And if you're recycling it, you're literally breaking it down apart and putting it back together. So there's a lot of energy that goes into that. Likewise, on this side, if you're thinking about food or organics, let's talk about food first, right? We know the inverted pyramid of like food that humans don't eat or food that doesn't get eaten goes to other humans first that maybe couldn't afford it, and then to animals so that they can eat it, to processes like anaerobic digestion, which can create energy as it breaks down, and then composting, and then the last hierarchy. I don't have this food pyramid. We've seen this before, the food pyramid, the inverted food pyramid. If anything I'm saying, if you're like, nah, I haven't heard it, I don't work in food, although I'm at IFC, just let me know. So there's these sort of extra circles out here where if you are using it for biogas, right, there's just more energy that has to go in, both into the process and then you also get out of it. I'm going to move on. So you've heard this mission before. This is, we're looking at cultivating local circular economies, so looking at systems like this, right, but at a local scale. This is very much thought, thinking globally as well. You use this term regenerative. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation defines circular economy as it aims to redefine growth. So the key thing with circular economy is it's still growing the economy, but you're decoupling the growth from infinite resource extraction or consumption. So we know, so the circular economy is like, we live on this planet with finite resources, but much of our economy is based on extraction of more and more. You can argue about when those things might run out, but you can't argue that they will run out. So fossil fuels, right, even if you just say like, oh, there's like carbon's having no impact on our atmosphere, just make that up. It's still a finite resource that will run out of someday, right? So in an idealized circular system, we're not relying on things like fossil fuels, which we can't technically make. I know there's companies that are looking at ways to recapture the carbon as well, but it's based on 3 principles. So the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use. So another way of saying that is like nutrients in use and play, and then regenerating natural systems. And regenerating is a pretty loose term, and I can go into that in a little bit more detail. We've defined it for many years because we have operated at the facility scale, is that really just illustrating like outputs from one process being used as an input for another. That kind of eliminates the economy side of it. It also eliminates the important social side. Right now we've been thinking at more of a local scale, that it's a collaborative economic practice sustained by local circulation of materials, nutrients, knowledge, and money. And it's empowered by transparency, diversity, and inclusion. So this is very much an outgrowth of the fact that as we look and we're working with the neighborhood where we're located, is that there's a tension when we start talking about closed loop systems. A closed loop system another way of thinking about it is like hoarding resources. So there's always this tension between being efficient and keeping resources flowing in your company and thinking about what resources, what knowledge, what money flows out to the people around you or the places you might have originally gotten those resources from. I'll quick go through some pictures, it's nice. We at Plant Chicago, we've historically run 3 main programmatic areas working with small businesses. So focusing on those businesses that aren't necessarily interested or they don't want an equity investment, they don't want to grow for growth's sake, they don't want to outsource their production, they're growing and making food, and that's what they want to do. We have been co-located with over 20 different food businesses, so we do work a lot with food. Circular economy is not limited to food. We've done research. If any of you visited before, we've housed an indoor farm that has gone through many different transformations and will be going through another sometime very soon. This is a visitor visiting our aquaponic farm, which has fish and plants growing together. The output from the fish helps fertilize the plants because it's high in nitrogen. But we've done research really exploring the economic and environmental potential of closing waste loops between small businesses, especially ones that we've been co-located with. We have a social mycology project, so we have a mycology lab that we have been gathering people together to open source and share knowledge and resources. It's cost prohibitive to buy an autoclave. Anybody who's interested in growing mushrooms or fungi for textiles or wants to experiment with micro-remediation of soils, they don't want to invest in a $5,000 autoclave to do that. So many of them end up growing stuff in their bathrooms and their spouses and roommates are not happy. Similarly, we've treated our farm as this sort of open source learning area too. This was a project a few years ago of someone doing what we call fogponics, which is essentially taking aquaponics water and just aerosolizing it in a way, it's not quite the right term, but making it into very fine water particles so that the roots and growing some microgreens on top of it. So it's a very dramatic looking picture. And then this is just a classic fuel source of taking organic gas and turning it into a combustible pellet. In this case, I think that's with 3 different types. It's 3 different pellets made from various percentages of spent brewer's grain. And there might be some paper in there from the mailroom in one of those, or coffee chaff in another one. I can't actually tell what's going on there, but this one looks like it's having some trouble. And then we've done tons of education, so like was said in the intro that we work with thousands of youth. This is actually a workshop we don't do anymore. You can see that they were at the time they were reusing single-use plastic. We actually don't allow single-use plastic anymore. So what the students will do in this, instead of making their own planters out of this, which is these I think were 2nd graders from Chavez High School, or not high school, 2nd graders from Chavez Elementary. They do a design challenge with aquaponics. So we actually have materials where they are challenged to make a system out of one set of materials, and each group has something slightly different. And that is Gandalf chicken. I don't know who that is. It's a fish. So we have been co-located with over 20 different food businesses in the plant for many years. The plant, if you're not familiar with it, is the name of a project. Plant Chicago was born out of this system and was responsible for starting many of the farms, the education, and actually indoor and outdoor farms as well, and the mushrooms here. Since we started in 2011, helped build a bunch of farms and then transferred those over to small for-profits, and there's actually a great community of growers now in the building, not a single grower, but multiple growers. There's a brewery on site as well. Has anyone ever had their beer? There you go. Wine or beer, delicious. And this whole system is actually owned by a for-profit entity. John Adel, he bought the building in 2010. He's the sole proprietor of a company called Bubbly Dynamics. And he bought the building. He still has plans to put greenhouses on the roof to capture some of that carbon dioxide and heat coming off the brewery process. What's exciting now, we're studying this, is that there is actually finally a connection of carbon dioxide between the brewery and one of the growers on site. So we're actually starting to measure the economic impact and the environmental impact of diverting the carbon dioxide they're growing. Many growers that are growing inside will import carbon dioxide to accelerate their growth of their plants. There was a company in the building that was like essentially burning propane to get carbon dioxide as a test. So now that they're not burning that, it's like, there's not just the cost of burning the propane, but less cost of them trying to actually like cool the room down after they burn propane. You might be familiar with this, anaerobic digesters. Have you heard of those before? Right. The anaerobic digester on site is not running, and it's not a project that Plant Chicago is involved in. What is there is a primary stage digester. There are many digesters that have been installed all over the world. There's several thousand in the US. Most of those are installed by municipalities to deal, they're usually dealt to deal with waste, right? Any of you work for companies that have anaerobic digesters or using it or thinking about like investing in them that you can talk about? No. Wow, amazing. Okay, so the food companies that are doing it, right, I think like Magic have breweries, and breweries have them to deal with their spent grain. Obviously there's some dairy companies, or going to my friends from Iowa here. Are you familiar with anaerobic digester projects in Iowa at all? Okay, so I think there's like 200 or 300 that are installed in dairy farms or pig farms to deal with the manure, right? So in many cases, there's this giant pile of stuff that comes out of consumers like us that has to be dealt with. And instead of dealing with the fines that might come from it, right, they they invest in an anaerobic digester to get a little bit of energy out of it as well. And then you can get some compost out of it. The challenge in urban environments, especially in Cook County, is that you can't direct apply liquid digestate to the ground because it is high. It's got could have a lot of nutrients in it, nitrogen and phosphorus, and that could be considered a pollutant if it gets into our waterways. Whereas in more rural applications, you could direct apply it onto farmers' fields and recapture those nutrients in the digestate. Any questions before I go on? Yes.
So how do you handle water?
How does the building handle water?
Yeah, well, the water has a cycle too, right?
It sure does, and that's actually another tension in the circular economy. Community like this movement is like how to deal with water. Is it a material? Like, do you count it as a material in the whole life cycle analysis? It's really tough. In Chicago, water's so cheap that there's very few incentives to cut back on it. And I actually might, do I have a slide about that? No, but I can talk about it here. So this was a project we did 3 years ago with an intern. She actually was from a university in France, but was working with UIC for a year. And she spent 3 months with us trying to do an LCA analysis of every single business that was co-located with us. So this is already way out of date. There's no longer, Pleasant House actually isn't in the facility anymore. Roomy Spice is not there as well. Nick Green's is not there, but there's a new set of businesses. What she found was like flows going between all these businesses of materials and nutrients. The overwhelming majority was that brewery that was sucking up water and grain. And most of that water passes right through, right? So it goes, or it ends up in the beer, right? It's like I think it's like a 1 to 8 ratio, like eight parts water to 1 part beer that comes out. And that's pretty standard in the brewing industry. There are larger brewers that are recapturing water and have systems to recapture it, but there isn't one here in the facility that we've been in. This is just an interesting diagram I like to put up because it captured a lot of the different stuff that was going, but overwhelmingly it's spent brewer's grain, and thankfully all of that's being composted. So circular economy is already happening. I talked about this earlier, but the economy, like the economy today is one, the circular economy is really one that has been around for a long time. And it is one that already exists in places of necessity. So if you like go to Cuba, right, and someone's driving around on a 1959 Studebaker and you start talking about the circular economy, like what are you talking about? We've been doing it for years. We've been keeping these materials in play. They're growing a lot of their food in urban environments. And they're doing it out of necessity. The circular economy is very much, in my mind, a solution to a problem that's created in economies where there's excess resources and lots of excess wealth. So when we have a perception of abundance, the circular economy is there to remind us that maybe we should be thinking about our lifestyles differently. Likewise, these guys, they were doing it for a long time, recapturing materials. Where we are on the southwest side of Chicago, outside of the plant, you go up Ashland Avenue, there's thrift shops, we have a bi-weekly market where they're reselling all those what we call technical nutrients. There are shops that are refurbishing appliances that you can buy. So this exists around us already. So that we have to be careful when we talk about, hey, have you heard about the circular economy? To think about, well, it's been around for a long time. We've practiced regenerative agriculture for a long time historically, until we started extracting nitrogen out of the air and pumping it into the soil. There's some challenges, right? Just some cautions that I like to bring up because of where we're operating. Regenerative economy, you have to account for things that are not easily monetized. So equity issues, you can create a very perfect system where like Amazon and Google are like have this perfect system where they're sharing resources back and forth, but like only a few people are actually benefiting from it. So you have to think about equity issues. doesn't happen in isolation. You'll hear now, I've been to a lot of conferences where there's lots of companies that are like, hey, we're a circular economy company now because we're recapturing 70% of our materials internal to our systems, and they're talking about themselves. Where, from my perspective, the circular economy is inherently a collaborative practice. You have to have at least two entities that are sharing back and forth. The resources have to flow between companies, unless you want a monoculture of one company or a monopoly of one company that's perfectly, somehow recapturing all the nutrients. So just a caution of like thinking about, when we talk about circularity, we try and acknowledge at least two players in it. Like there's always at least two connections that are going together. Open space, this is a broader economy issue too, how do you think about a national park or a park as having value? Clearly, I think most of us see a lot of value in it, and then we try and think about property values around a park and justify it that way. It's a troublesome thing, and when you talk about economy in the first place, it's like how do you talk about the value of something that, it's like how do you value love? Like what's the price, right? A ring? Is that your price of love? For some, yes, I think it is. Meeting community and ecosystem needs. So like if you think about an ecosystem, right, we often talk about making it biodiverse, having a diverse system. What is the need of the community where you're operating? Closed loop, I talked about this earlier, closed loop or resource sorting. If you were in a desert and you're using all the water, like if you're diverting all the Colorado River for your operation, there are people downstream who might think like, hey, what are you doing with all our water? Why don't you release some of that for us, right? Efficiency or more consumption. Jevons paradox, anyone familiar with that? It's a paradox. There was an economist who once said, we did a study, and, to think about the more efficient we make something, the more we use it, and often it leads to more consumption. So if you think about, hey, I've got so many efficient electronics now, because those electronics are more efficient, or you buy a Prius, you're more likely to drive it further because you don't feel as bad. So you end up using it more because it is more efficient. So there's a paradox there. As we make systems more efficient, we can actually lead to more consumption. So you have to be careful about just talking about efficiency, although it's good to think about, especially from a company perspective. Population growth, planetary boundaries. We're already talking about like system boundaries of the Earth, and like reaching to what's the carrying capacity of the Earth. It's just a little scary. We talk about 2050 as being like 10 billion people on the Earth. And you start having conversations about, well, like, no, we could really extract more out of the Earth and support more of a population, but at what cost? We're just a few years away from 8 billion on the Earth. And if we're really going to be making change, right, we have to think about 2050, but we have to be doing it now. We don't want to be trying to change our diet 30 years from now. And I talk about our diet from what we eat, but also our diet, literally what we consume, the materials. And then politics, ego, and trust, the underlying force. So there's always these other forces. Basic human ego, we have it. Some people clash with their egos. And trust can be a huge barrier to the sort of collaborative force here of like thinking about collaborating with others as well. Our principles and practices, we've thought a lot about this. Using renewable energy, creating products that are made from materials that can be recaptured, however you define that, if it's compostable. Sourcing local, and then, so upstream, sourcing local, and then downstream waste recovery. This is what doesn't get talked about a lot, equitable benefits. Businesses share. So I don't have a huge background working for large businesses, but what I have felt was working with small businesses is that becomes much easier. Again, I think it's because of necessity. As a small business, you're very vulnerable, so you're more likely to reach out to maybe someone who might on the surface seem like a competitor, and work with them to share resources. So I'll take the example of two kombucha brewers, which actually shared infrastructure, right? They're creating essentially the same product in the capitalistic system. They're competitors, but it made sense for them to work together on that. I know that happens at the larger scale as well, but I found that the small business ecosystem, there is this natural tendency to gravitate towards collaboration, a lot of times out of necessity. sharing resources, so how far can you go with thinking about sharing your resource? The big question in the circular economy is who pays for it. I'll take brewers' grains again. So there's breweries that have all this spent grain that comes out. Larger breweries might be able to afford an anaerobic digester. Smaller breweries can't. They want to give it away to a farmer who might take it. The farmer's like, well, why don't you pay me for it because you would normally pay for it. So there's back and forth with who pays for the circular economy, like in figuring that out. That's a negotiation. And then how do the communities where you're located benefit? I'm not going to go too much into this, but we'll talk about it. Individuals. Minimizing personal ownership of stuff. So thinking about how far can you go with the service aspect of it. Everybody, I mean, I love the idea of like having a big lawn and like, I actually do like mowing a lawn on a tractor. But like, do everyone need to own it? So there is a give and take there with like how far can you take sharing stuff or paying for services? I use the example of the jeans as well. How many pieces of clothing do we need to own? Anyone here going Marie Kondo pick? Marie Kondo? You don't know Marie Kondo? She's like this, just like amazingly charming woman who like her English is sometimes hard to understand sometimes, but like she basically convinces people to like give away most of her stuff. Yeah, okay. I thought this was like a huge cultural thing that happened, and I was behind the times. Marie Kondo, you want to explain Marie Kondo?
So she's someone who believes in minimalistic living. So she is like she give away things that don't spark a joy.
It's don't spark a joy. That's right.
Joy is
Yeah.
nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, we all have like a closet somewhere. We've got stuff that we've been hanging on for years. I have some things that I've held on to sentimental reason. You know, like I'm still having trouble getting rid of them. And she says like, does it give you joy in your heart? And if it doesn't, you say goodbye, and there's a whole ceremony to like say goodbye to it and wish it for its good. Just watch it in the YouTube video tonight. You'll love her. She's great. Minimalizing single-use items, especially plastics. So I'm not going to say that like plastics don't have a role in our economy, but certainly the amount of single-use that we have is creating a lot of problems. Check your beef, find CSA. So yes, beef, and most of us just had a meal of beef. We're talking about it, but if you want to think about, just from a carbon perspective, one of the biggest impacts you can have is minimizing how much beef you actually eat. I am not a vegetarian, but I do minimize how much I try to eat. It can be hard sometimes because we get it fed a lot. I was telling my table, my father-in-law is from Uruguay, so like literally every meal is like steak. That's what he makes, steak. So that's where I know, that's where I go and get my steak. And then CSAs, I brought up community-supported agriculture because there's actually studies been done. So like we're really efficient about growing food. Like we can like maximize how much food we extract and grow. Like it's really amazing, but the system itself of getting that food into people is really inefficient. We're anywhere from 30 to 40%. We're wasting in the U.S. 30 to 40% of the food we grow for human consumption. So when we talk about efficiency, we're really efficient at growing it and terrible at actually eating it. But CSAs, like community-supported agriculture, or other models where there might be consignment models as opposed to traditional retail, can actually be much more efficient in terms of the amount you grow and the amount that gets eaten. So thinking about that is actually something like signing up for a CSA, community-supported agriculture, and then a farmer is growing for you, and it's typically a much more efficient system in terms of the amount of food that gets eaten, and they're generally not as efficient at like growing as much food. Oh no, did I just turn it off? There we go. Downstream, regenerating the soil, make some compost. There are composting services in Chicago. Everybody, residential businesses can sign up for it, and there are some that take these compostable plates as well. A lot of them might balk at the cutlery, like the bamboo, bamboo forks and things like that, because those do not break down well. Bicycles are the original circular transport. If you can bike somewhere, do it. We don't all have that luxury to do it. Limiting your time up in the air. Are you familiar with United Airlines? United Airlines is actually in is it LA? I think it's in LA. Some of their planes are running off of a fuel source that's all bio-based, and it's coming from food waste. So there are, I think United is the first airline that did that. It's a very small amount of their fuel source, but to think about that potential would be pretty cool. Limiting our ownership, but also use of new appliances. Maybe refurbish when you can. Sourcing and supporting local, and then support businesses that are engaging in circular economy practices, especially those that are transparent. So transparency is a big challenge, right? Especially for any business, is how transparent are you about successes and failures? Every business wants to talk about their successes, but talking about your failures, I think, is a very interesting thing. If a business can be transparent about what they're setting out to do and then report on it later and be like, hey, we didn't get there, but we tried. I think that would be a really exciting thing to see more often. I'm going to stop there for questions, and I have some more updates as well, but I just want to stop for questions. Yes?
Question, I mean, there've been, business models made of, monthly subscription vegetables
Yeah.
that are imperfect per
Are you talking about
se.
imperfect produce? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, on scale, if they ship out a much, but, you know, in terms of like getting it to the actual consumer, you know, you have like your local community based, but it won't necessarily produce enough to, what are your thoughts in terms of like imperfect produce? Is it a means to an end, or is it, do we focus more on the local?
Yeah, I don't want to comment on a
Sorry,
specific
sorry.
company like that, but I'd say in general, anything that we can do to diversify our source of food. I don't know if necessarily imperfect produce does that, but we're highly dependent on California. We're highly dependent on, in Illinois, we're growing food not for people, we're growing it for animals and, fuel and, we're exporting it to other places. The more we can grow locally, the better, and eat seasonally as well. Like, we're way too used to trying to get a peach in January. It usually tastes terrible.
You're familiar with Shameless Pets here in Chicago?
No, I'm not. Oh, they make spent grain?
So
That is-
Shameless Pets
Yeah.
is a model that kind of hits what you're talking about. Basically what they do is it's a guy from Target that, if you don't mind me really quickly telling the story.
No.
It's a guy from, I met him at Food Bites, and since it I will introduce him.
Yeah.
So his basic premise was he was at Target, he helped with produce, right? And he saw this produce go to waste, right? Because they don't sell it. Right in front of the store, basically fresh, but nobody buys it at Target. So he said, what if I could repurpose that towards, as a byproduct towards pet food? So he works with restaurants and all these retail chains. He takes the waste and converts it into pet food. So that's a good example of, I think, what you're aiming at.
Yep.
And it's Chicago local.
Yeah, there's other folks in Chicago
Yeah.
local that are looking at pulp, like vegetable
That's kind
and
of a
fruit
good
pulp.
example of what I
Right.
think he's going for.
Yeah.
That,
Yeah.
would kind of align to it.
So this is a great example where I do think government should step in and work on food waste bans and diversion goals there, because there's no reason we should be sending, food, there is real economic opportunity in it. There are companies that are looking at it, but with that kind of framework to make sure companies are not, and individuals as well, are not sending food waste to landfills, that's going to generate new economic opportunity for sure. You think about compost, it's essentially, it's sort of the quintessential hyper-local economy. There's no, if you're getting compost from food waste, there's no reason to be shipping that to, across the border. That is something that can be used locally and should be used locally as well. So composting, there is a very strong argument, I think, for government incentives and mandates around that. Something like 20% by volume of landfills around the Chicago region are organics, right? That construction waste, yeah.
Is there any incentive in Chicago and the suburbs to get folks to separate out their waste? In other countries, you've got your food waste in one bin, and you've got, plastics, and and you separate them out, and then they're taken.
It's definitely a cultural issue in the U.S. Putting in the
Other
effort.
countries,
South Korea, amazing food
it's
collection,
mandate,
or
it's
food
not
waste.
cultural, it's, that's what you gotta do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, so,
And I changed the culture.
what do you mean, like you said, not change the culture?
No, that does change the
Oh,
culture.
oh yeah, you can then it doesn't change overnight, but I think right now from markets perspective, you get a lot of people who are signing up for composting service because they can afford it and because they're just outraged by the fact that it wouldn't go somewhere else. Like our nonprofit signs up, we collect other people's batteries because we're outraged that the official line in Chicago is like, well, they're safe to throw in the trash now because they don't have mercury in it, right, or whatever. There's all that material in there, so there's the outrage of people who can afford it. If you can afford to do it, right? Get your compost collected and do it. In terms of separating, there are, I don't know all of the suburbs, but it was interesting. We just had a panel discussion last week with somebody from the city of Evanston, and Evanston, I would consider. It's funny, I had thought of them as a leader in the region in terms of thinking about recovery from what a municipality can do, which, the representative there was like, we're looking at Chicago. If Chicago does it, everyone else does it. It gives, it's like a big company, right? So if a big company suddenly is like, we're not doing styrofoam anymore, or we're gonna source plant-based protein, it allows everyone else. It's when the big players do it, it impacts everyone else. So it makes sense, but I hadn't thought of that before. Someone I thought as a leader in this, and I have never lived in Evanston, but there could be a cultural difference in Evanston compared to much of Chicago as well. Chicago breeds a lot of cynicism with the way Chicago works. It doesn't work, so people, when they read a report of poor recycling rates, get cynical and then are less likely to separate. There's also no enforcement right now in Chicago, so people don't, large buildings don't get fined if they're not recycling, so there's very little incentive for them to do it. Does that answer your question?
No.
Okay, can you ask it again? I'd like to address it. What was your question?
No, it's just,
Yeah.
in other countries,
Uh-huh,
I know in country I'm from, Ireland,
yeah,
right? In our culture, you had to put your food waste in one
Yeah.
bin, and you put plastic in another.
yeah,
And you just do it.
because it's mandated.
Mandate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, it's not here. Or it is mandated, but it's not enforced.
He's
In
friends
some
with
cases.
Lightfoot, so he'll take care of it if he's some more.
No, but this thing in Chicago, I know it's the dog wagging the tail, and you want to get the dog, but there's more people living outside Chicago than in Chicago.
Yeah,
So you think about it?
but they're also separated, right? So it's, Oak Brook and all these other municipalities are doing their own thing and they get their own pushback. So the more they can say, hey, Chicago's doing it. I mean, right now, Oakland is a 70% recycling rate, right? So part of it is come on, shame Chicago into doing this. Also very hard. So this is where I go back to composting, is that it's actually can be a money-saving thing when in a city where we're talking about budget deficits. Composting could be revenue or neutral, right? So if you're already paying, the city's already paying to haul stuff away, right? If you're shifting that over to composting as well, it is something that potentially might not cost or save the city money as well. I'll give you another example, culture. So the Mexican restaurant on the corner, I talk to them all the time, and they're trying to get rid of their styrofoam packaging, but they're everybody who comes in expects it. Whereas when Mexico, that was the opposite. Everybody came in with their own container. And it's coming to the US where the culture isn't expecting it yet. But yeah, I do think mandating is at certain levels is good, and it's not anti-economy.
Yeah. I know I traveled in the UK, and if you bring your own coffee,
Yeah.
you get cheap coffee.
Yeah, yeah,
That's simple.
yeah. And there's companies that try it here too. I think Starbucks tried it, and I don't know if they're still doing it. But our culture is very addicted to convenience. Just think about how many people were like anti-bag tax, you know? So,
Well, I know Costco's got the answer, don't find me.
they don't provide it in the first place, exactly. And then we were like, okay, I'll figure that out, right? We figured it out, we're adults, you know? Yeah, they do, because it's a little bit cheaper. They see it directly there, like, oh, I will deal with this because I'm getting a cheaper price,
All be the same?
right? Yeah. So, I think it's shifting. Other questions or thoughts?
Is there an overlap between like existing waste streams and closed loop systems that might be able to migrate some of that where the closed loop systems can benefit from taking care of what larger manufacturers are already producing?
Say it again, I'm not sure I understood it.
Like large manufacturers of ingredients that aren't part of a closed loop manufacturing system like you're describing, maybe have waste streams that could be integrated into a closed loop, you know, there's a kind of an overlap.
Yeah, so actually, I talked about this I have a love-hate relationship with that term, closed loop. We use it here in tagline, it's like open source closed loop. So I think, because in the first place, like the Earth is not a closed loop system. Like we're accepting a major energy input from the sun, we're losing gas molecules to space all the time, and heat. Yeah, I mean, there's this interplay between, right now in the US, we're relying a lot on companies, or we're putting the blame on consumers as well. So like consumers are like, hey, don't buy single-use plastic, but then there's companies that are producing all the single-use plastic, so you have no choice but to buy it. Actually, I think Lent this year, I was like, I'm not gonna buy single-use plastic, and it was like, there's certain products that I couldn't buy pasta, right? Everything had plastic on it. So there's this dual responsibility where companies really need to think about and show it, and the more they can talk about it and be transparent, like we're doing it because of this reason. You know, there are always opportunities there. There's always opportunities. Struggle with companies, you have problematic products like, you know, Nike says they have, I don't know how many tens of thousands of materials in their products. And so they're making these really complex, highly sophisticated products, but it's made with all these materials that is like really difficult to like recycle again once they've made it. So there is that challenge there, like they're highly cognizant of it, that they're making these products that are difficult, but they're also taking them back. I don't know if that addressed your question, but I do think there's lots of opportunities. It has to be built into the business model. There has to be like a line item on there, like here's our byproduct. It's making us money, or maybe it's making someone else money, but it's not going to landfill, right? Yeah. You could report that too. We made that company $50,000 last year. But that'd be a cool report.
Something you guys are reaching out to, looking for, maybe just a way to kind of bridge the gap, that's all.
Yeah. We're not big enough yet, I think, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna throw out an example well, two examples actually that I know of. One is a company called Regrain. They do the spent grains
Yeah.
into nutrition bars, and that's a much higher use for the spent grain
Yeah.
than an anaerobic digester.
Yeah.
And in my company, we actually upcycle crop leftovers, but we can also take waste streams from other processes, and we extract the residual sweeteners and fiber out of them, and sell them as purified ingredients for additional use. So there are some companies doing what we call upcycling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And the real trick will be when we get to a point where companies are competing for that waste,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you can really upcycle it. I'll say some other things too. So Plant Chicago, we've been a nonprofit in the facility known as the plant for years. We're actually winding our physical presence down. We're moving on to another project. I can't announce it yet, but what we're looking at is actually something that is bridging the gap between commercial and residential, and thinking about new ways of growing at smaller scales. So actually, our farm being a collaborative space somewhere in between retail and a community garden. So actually having people come in who have been interested in growing indoors, having time and space to use our infrastructure to grow themselves. We can either sell that, they can take it home for themselves. Again, this idea that people who want to grow indoors are less likely to do it if they have to pay for it at first and don't know how to do it. So giving them the space to do that as well is is what we're looking at, and growing in the social mycology project, we're piloting a circular economy network for small businesses. The idea is that there are small businesses that want to, I was just talking about the Mexican restaurant, they want to like reduce their reliance on styrofoam, do these things, but there's a cultural lack in the US, especially in Chicago, and to do that, but having a network where there are other small businesses working on it, there's opportunities to pool resources and share knowledge as well. Some of the most effective things that we've seen for businesses working together is literally getting them together, two people in a room, and they're like, hey, I got this thing, and like, hey, I got a use for that, and you can spend all this time on like social media and like trying to connect the dots, but sometimes it's just people getting in the room, so like this, that's what is still effective about networking events for me, is like getting the people in the room together and talking. I haven't seen much work better than that. Yeah.
So you talked about earlier about like recycling, composting. If you can pay to do it, you can do it. But how do you promote that without shaming people who can't afford to do it?
Mhm.
Like you're talking about refurbishing appliances. There's a culture around that,
Yeah.
but not shaming the people who
Oh,
already do
yeah.
it or taking it away from
There's a
them.
lot of shame out there, food shame as well, right? We talk about tension between vegetarians and vegans and people who don't eat it. It's often a privilege to be able to decide what you eat, right? So when you start shaming people about what they eat, it doesn't really result in a good dialogue. That's why I really try to stay away from that. Yeah, if you can afford it, do it. If you can't, right, there should be, again, government support to do it. Or business support, other business models that can use the revenue from people who can afford it to subsidize people who can't. That's where you get a lot of CSA models, right? They recognize that their product might be more expensive, so they'll say, but this year, 10 of these are gonna be subsidized, we're gonna give it to you 50% off. Our market that we run, we double the value of produce, so if it is higher cost, right, where people can use their link cards in Illinois to get twice, for our market, they can get twice the produce for half the cost. They can get $50 worth of produce for 25. So there is this sort of, for lack of a better word, like redistribution. It doesn't have to be socialist. It doesn't also have to be like government run, right? Businesses can do it too. Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to build on that and address it, because like I worked with Chef Rick Bayless in '97. We launched, and some like basically Frontera Foods, but what it was based on was how do we get local farmers to supply? And I think what I would do is I would change shame into empowerment, and say it's your choice to buy local or to buy a national brand, right? And the more we empower local, the more we can make these shifts, because it's micro shifts, it's not macro shifts. And that's kind of what I think is missing from the equation, is we think, gosh, all these food companies have all this power. They don't. We're consumers. We don't buy. They don't have power. So I think, kind of trying to intentionally look at your community, what the offerings are, what you can do by yourself, what you can do in your community, and then what businesses you can support that are local, make a huge shift in this kind of closed loop, open source kind of idea. But that would just be a
Yeah, I think that's a huge issue to tap into, is this idea of shame, and not recognizing that there are people that have the power to make a choice and the other ones that don't. Or some people that are already doing things and you don't realize it. Yeah. Any questions or thoughts? I love that everyone's talking to each other right now. It's kind of cool that I'm not.
I guess we'll be kicked out at 9, so.
Okay.
We
So
might wanna wrap
don't,
up if you guys wanna talk to him a little
Yeah,
after, but.
thanks for joining. I would love to learn more about what the group of food scientists is doing as well, because I like science.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.